Hello, everyone. My name is Catherine Whited, and I am the Education Coordinator for Landmarks. I want to thank Arcos and the student dancers for the incredible choreography they created in response to Sarah's commission. It's so wonderful to see the work interpreted through other artistic mediums, and we are so fortunate to be on a campus where there is such a wealth of talent. Now we've arrived at the Q&A portion of our event. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers, artist Sarah Oppenheimer, Limi Tan, Senior Curator at the Kitchen in New York and curatorial contributor for this project, and Andre Bober, Landmark's founding director and curator. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you to Andre and everyone at Landmarks for inviting me to be the curatorial contributor on this project. It's been such a privilege to take part and to work closely with Sarah and Andre on the text and the audio guide and now this public program. And so we're going to begin by watching a video of the installation. And please note that Sarah and I will begin our conversation after the video, which is about 4 minutes long. And so we will not be talking over the video.
I'm gonna put it about where you are.
Thank you, everyone, for processing that video. And so we wanted to begin the Q&A with this remarkable installation video to highlight the careful choreography of labor that it took to realize C-010106. And I was really delighted that it could follow the distinct choreography of the Arcos film as well. And we can speak more about this later, but the installation video, I think, also really addresses the co-authorship, to borrow a term Sarah has used in the artist video, of this piece on every level. And so while we took that video in silence, I wanted to begin the conversation by addressing the language around this piece, and something that has really driven my own experience of the work, not having seen it in person, unfortunately, as I'm in New York and I hope to make it to Austin at some point, is that, Sarah, you have such a precise approach to language that really helps us understand the intentions of not only this particular work, but of your practice as a whole. And so I wanted to start out just by kind of, defining as best we can a few of these terms that you use so we can all partake in a shared vocabulary within this discussion. And so first I wanted to discuss how you consider C-010106 an apparatus or also an instrument, as you have said in your video, versus a sculpture, a work, even though I have used that term, okay, I'll admit, or an installation, which are all terms that might be more common or familiar to us, even those who are deeply embedded in describing art.
So I think that's a really wonderful place to begin. And I believe that the term apparatus is incredibly useful because it describes a device or a technical object that is functional, that performs. And it performs in some way in tandem with a kind of operator. There's a sense that the apparatus is very close to the sort of human operator. And this seems particularly germane and relevant as a sort of turn, as a way of describing this piece, because my work is very interested in that sort of how to create, or my work creates, I would say, circulatory pathways that link buildings and occupants, or buildings and bodies in some ways. And I want the work to operate as a sort of medium in between those two things, and to play with the sort of thickness of the that liminal thickness between the occupant and the environment that they are situated in. One more comment about that, Lumi, is that I think that the term apparatus is really useful also because it takes us out of the term sculpture or the term installation. And the term sculpture, I think, in some ways is a bit deceptive because its history is quite open-ended, but often it implies a thing, an object. And I really want to deflect away from the object and deflect away from a notion of space that is to be filled, which is a term that I think installation often refers to, that you have a given, you have this architectural envelope, and then you sort of fill it up or you respond to it. And I'm not actually interested in either of those conditions. I really want, in some ways, to think of the work as a medium of social and sort of structural exchange.
And I think that exchange certainly, relates to a few other terms that were brought up, I think, in our initial studio visit and were really fundamental to me in my writing about the work, which was the ideas of the input and output, as well as the operational field, if you could address those terms.
Yeah, I think that just to say a bit more about this notion of an apparatus, I understand that in some ways we are inhabiting an environment that we're entirely entangled with, that we are not somehow separate from this sort of imagined inanimate world that we are in contact with and manipulating all the time. And that entanglement is in some ways an exchange. And we can sort of make systems out of that exchange, or we can notice patterns in that exchange. But that exchange is sort of the fabric of our daily existence in a way. And in trying to make sense of how this work can operate as, or any work that I'm creating can operate as a circulatory pathway, I try to imagine what sorts of exchanges happen through the contours of the work. So what is input into the work, what is output? And these inputs and outputs overlap, they become entangled by all sorts of different mechanisms. But by and large, I think those terms are really pointing towards that sort of field of constant flux and exchange that's happening between us and the world and the world and the world, et cetera.
Absolutely. And I think that, I mean, so often we're thinking of sculpture or installation or really kind of any artwork that is put into a space as autonomous. And I've, read many interviews or, heard many talks in which you really reject that idea of autonomy, and that that's the last thing you want to make is this autonomous object. And so I think that also flows quite naturally into your system for titling and the relationalities that your titles point to in this way. If you could speak to that system that you've created.
Yeah, I think that somehow the titles have become this sort of like puzzle or mystery that needs to be decoded or figured out. But there's in some ways a missing piece that needs to be discussed before the title, which I just want to elaborate on, because I think that the titles are best understood by understanding a bit of their conceptual underpinning. So in 2014, I wrote a very short text called The Array. And that text has been very important in my own thinking over a long period of time. And The Array basically discusses how this built environment that we inhabit is by and large very organized through a set of codes and social conditions and machine systems. And that means that space is not unique. It is in fact systematized. It is produced through a set of socially encoded and materially grounded conditions. And this array, which is sort of this reproducible fabric of constructed space, is largely invisible to us. We wander around, we don't notice it, we don't understand where or how it sort of extends outward. And I'm very interested in how a work can intervene or sort of disrupt this patterned presence of interior space such that it sets up different types of flows through it. It becomes an apparatus where, let's say, light or sight or kinesthetic exchange occurs across this boundary, this arrayed boundary, which is sort of proliferating our environment. So the titles really grow out of this, and the titles in large part assume space is divided, and that across these boundaries that are sort of regular and in some ways not unique or not specific, certain things flow. And each title, each digit in the title describes what flows across those boundaries and how those boundaries operate. So you'll notice in the video, the bridge divides a kind of a space below and a space above. So the title is a sort of alphanumeric code, which first describes the spatial relationships between above and below. And then each digit stands for a different type of sort of, let's call it, exchange across that boundary.
Thank you for that. I also wanted to highlight the C part of that title, which stands for cinema. If you could briefly explain that.
Yes, not to forget the letter.
Yes.
The letter, it's a very good point. The letter that prefaces this long string of numbers often will refer to a sort of perceptual condition that is set up by the work that's a sort of generalizable piece of the situation. So by cinema, what I'm referring to in some ways is a sort of, actually, I would say more of a screen-like condition. I'm talking about how this sort of complex dimensional reality that we exist in lands on sort of appears as if it is being projected upon a flat surface, even though in fact it's by and large a kind of sort of immaterial sense of spatial compression. And that's what the C stands for at the beginning of the title.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, to me, the use of cinema also, as I'm a curator who works with both exhibition and performance, the C standing for cinema, and it kind of points to the kind of interdisciplinary aims of this viewer experience that that you've constructed. And I'm always thinking about the position of the audience within my work, and I think that the emphasis you put on those dynamic aspects of the experience is very empowering towards the viewer. It's just not typically how one feels around art, and I think that particularly in this work, the closeness that you've mentioned previously really kind of highlights all of the different aspects that you've pointed out within the title, and the different flows and shifting experiences that one has with it.
So,
but sorry.
I actually, it's really interesting to hear you say that, Lumi, because I just want to respond to what you just were saying. I really am struck by how you're discussing this notion of audience, because I think in some ways I'm extremely interested in a kind of reciprocal exchange that happens across this sort of living membrane of the building. And in this case, that living membrane is the ground or the ceiling plane above us. And neither of those things do we register as sort of animus, alive or changing over time. And I'm very excited about how this piece in some ways makes that present and also allows for this very immediate exchange across that membrane, which we could see as, let's say, that boundary between audience and performer. But suddenly that boundary is like in flux and open.
And do you feel like audience in this case is not the right term to use?
I think audience is a really interesting term to use because it has this history, and it has this history in relation to things like viewing an artwork, that the viewer is the audience to the work. But in some ways, if this is an apparatus, then that becomes really confounded. And if the viewer is the input and the output, then where is this audience located? And I become very interested in that term. I think it's a really exciting frame.
Well, I think that, the piece really does all these things that you're pointing to. It's confounding the terms and confounding, what we come to expect from our encounters with artworks in general. And so now that we've defined these terms, I wanted to move to some questions of the site. And first, kind of the process of choosing the site with Landmarks.
So, as those who were involved in this project are well aware, this was a tremendously sort of long-term engagement with, and the piece started as an investigation into possible sites in the interior of the building. So I was looking at how the architect was developing plans for the subdivision of this large mass we're going to call initially this building envelope. And it became very clear to me that in some ways it was a bit of like a nested, like each division became increasingly small. And so there was a kind of constriction of how the piece could operate, the sort of extent of the work's operation. And I became very, very excited when I learned that there was going to likely be a footbridge that connected the campus, because a bridge in some ways operates much like a door or a window, which is something I've been thinking about for a very, very long time, in that it is a kind of connection. and that connection between here and there, and a text that's really guided my thinking about bridges and doors and windows is a really wonderful text by Simmel called Bridge and Door. And that text really pointed towards this project in some ways. I was like, oh, a bridge, and yet it's a door. And the thing that's particularly exciting about this site, the more I learned about the site, is that the bridge, in fact, has two axes. It has the axis of the kind of directional flow of the bridge, but then it has beneath it another 90-degree corridor, a corridor of precession that's at 90 degrees to the upper level of the bridge. So there's this kind of really interesting twist on the campus that is marked by traffic through the site, human traffic through the site, and air traffic through the site, and vehicular traffic through the site, all sorts of traffic through the site. It's quite a busy location. So I became very, very, very excited about that. And I also had made a number of projects prior to this work, which had really played with the porosity of the ground plane. So thinking about how an opening could happen through the floor, through ceiling, and what that did to the sort of kinesthetic experience of a person occupying a space. And so this set up a really amazing opportunity to make a hole in a bridge that could then actually have a human exchange across it rather than a kind of scaled up vehicular exchange across it.
Thank you. And I think you've touched on this just within that past answer, but you know, how you, well, perhaps actually how you could talk, if you could talk about how you thought it would change the function of the site and how you have seen it now that it is, you know, installed and being interacted with, if there is a kind of a difference between how you intended the function and how it's actually functioning.
So that's a really great question. I think that this project had and has a number of qualities that were really new to me. I had not worked on a piece that was built on a site that did not yet exist before.
Right.
And so there was a really interesting process of, let's say, identifying patterns of the built environment, identifying how, or imagining how one might see a kind of normative experience of space, and then trying to work against that in a place that didn't yet exist. So in some ways that becomes a problem of deciphering plans or kind of a tactile sense of materials, but you really don't know what that feels like because it's not there. It doesn't feel yet. So it was really amazing to watch the building come into being over the course of many years, and to really become very closely acquainted with so many people who were part of this building project. That was a great honor for me. And it was also really amazing then to watch the work somehow located in this situation, because it didn't actually ever work against a prior situation. It is a situation that exists. And I think the thing that was, or is, most striking to me about this work, which I would never have understood in advance, is just how it operates at a radically different scale than anything I've done before. And that's not the size of the piece. I think it has to do with how its situation in the site actually is like a really condensed node of exchange in a site that's already a large kind of exchange network. I mean, it's a big traffic zone. So if you set up a really tight switch in a larger switch, it's just somehow an extremely charged thing that expands outward. And it's just made me reconsider what it means to operate on an urban scale, that you can operate on an urban scale by doing something actually quite small.
Right, just that small switch changes everything. And so how did that experience differ from your previous kind of museum or institutional or even gallery experiences in which, you know, the built environment was there and you were kind of inserting your work into it?
Well, I think it led to a wonderful sense of the unexpected. And it also set up a much deeper integration into all of, let's call it, the choreography and the social relationships that come to make place. And we, in some ways, imagine the place has always been there, will always be there. We walk through a door into a building and we think, oh, that building is solid and it's fixed and it's not moving. And I think it really reinscribed that constant shifting relation of our environment. And it also, in some ways, really accelerated for me the speed of change, the speed of how a building changes, how a site changes. And it was really just tremendous. It's been tremendously exciting. And I think the other thing about it that's really different is the surprise of the viewer, or the inhabitant, because in a in a museum situation, there's a kind of bracket around work, even if it isn't the most unexpected place,
Right.
that you come to almost knowing it will be there. And there's a sense often that a viewer will bring to it of a kind of historical, there's a historical and a perceptual frame that is sort of brought to bear on that experience. And I think that something that's just been shocking to me about this piece is that that's all gone. And so suddenly someone's just, you know, walking somewhere and they find this thing and they're like, what in the world is this? And they sort of turn around and they come back and then they start to like trying to figure out how it's working, and they walk below the bridge and then they walk back on top of the bridge. And there's just this really beautiful discovery that's possible in an environment where it's not tagged as an art location. And also it doesn't then need to read as an artwork at all. It doesn't have to be an artwork. It can just be there. It can just be an apparatus. And that's kind of a great gift.
Yes, and I think that I've read, I think a statement from you in previous talk about, you know, a campus as a place where, you know, people in remote locations, but then come together to create a collective space. And, you know, that kind of like this work being actually a space where people can create like a collective experience, right? It actually like unites people in all these very unexpected ways from below and above, and unites people with the environment as well. And you know, the effect that has on what you have called, you know, what you mentioned as like the kind of urban environment of the campus. You know, it's a moment to come together in a way that's not really as structured as a classroom, or, you know, as a titled space, let's say, for gathering, but, you know, is just this small, I mean, I don't want to use small, but, you know, this intervention that is unexpected within the daily practice of the day. And I think, you know, when we first met in your studio, you know, one of the very first things that you discussed was the idea of access and your emphasis on these expansive ideas of accessibility and this, you know, really beautiful and generous term to use of kind of like gestural access. And so this has been brought up previously, you know, for instance, how you've used ADA requirements within the work, but if you could just speak to how those codes and legal governances are generative rather than restrictive in your practice, and how that relates to access, I think that would be very helpful for everyone.
So,
or informative for everyone.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that ADA is such a present question here, because and I think there's lots to be said about ADA. But I will say in some ways, just to return for a moment to this notion of the array. Our environment is, and the sort of conditions we find ourselves in often in our built environment, and it is very, very encoded, and it's very rule bound. And those rules are often invisible to us. They're generally invisible to us. And ADA is a set of rules that are about human occupation and a kind of access to space that coexists with any number of other set of rules that have to do with how a human being occupies space and the rules by which space is organized. But it becomes very important because a number of sort of immediate concerns around accessibility are sort of nested into this particular code. I became really, really excited about ADA because it is a code that is invisible, that drives our built environment and can be played with like all the other codes. And it has a really wonderful relationship to the human body. And because I'm very interested in the human body and the extent of gesture and the extent of step, that became almost like a poem. And it's kind of beautiful to imagine ADA as a poem, because then you can start to play scales on it and you can kind of stretch it and pull it and like find beautiful things in those rules. And I think the thing that became most exciting to me was this idea of the guardrail, which Sharon spoke about briefly. Because a guardrail is, as many of you who have walked through public space know, often required if you have a hole in the ground. And it's often required if you have a sculpture that you don't want people to jump onto or through into the ground below. But if you actually study the rules of how guardrails are in fact prescribed and aligned with the height of the body, there's actually just a very simple number, a height by which you need to bound something. So that lower diagonal piece of glass is sort of performing a double function. On the one hand, it is performing a set of, as an apparatus, it's creating this sort of circulation, but it's also limiting the height at which a person can lean into this artwork. And that is a kind of gestural action of the body. It's a kind of leaning forward and looking through. It also has to do with who has access at a certain height, but that and sort of the distance from to the edge of that, to the edge of the bridge, all of those things were driven by ADA. And that became really, really useful in thinking about how the space was organized, and also how, well, one other thing to say. I'm very interested in making us aware of these patterned conditions. But on the other hand, there are certain patterned conditions that one is not aware of. So, and I'm interested in that play of what is visible and what is kept invisible. So how do you heighten perception of certain types of patterns and reduce perception of others? And one thing that's reduced here is actually ADA, that you don't perceive this piece as a handrail, but you do perceive this kind of subdivision of above and below. And that's kind of that's the poem.
I think that's just an incredibly, I mean, that's just such a beautiful way to approach something as, what is seen as restrictive as ADA, and if we could see all codes as poems or scores to be expanded upon and integrated in all these different ways, I think, we would feel much less constricted in our daily lives. And I think that relates to something that you have mentioned, which I was really struck by, which was that you mentioned that by greatly reducing the complexity of form, you're far more able to set up extremely complex relationships. And to me, that has a direct line to kind of how you treated that the ADA within this, the ADA needs within this piece. I don't know if you could just speak to other ways that you saw that within C-010106.
Yeah, there are so many ways that's at work, and more, I think that becomes really important, what you're describing. So I'm going to sort of flesh out the idea, and then I'll describe sort of an instance of that here. I think that if we are having a kind of complex exchange, or even not complex, a nuanced exchange, a quiet exchange, anything that happens as a kind of transaction, if we can reduce the thing that's being kind of holding that transaction so that we can listen to the transaction itself, I think it makes us more sensitive to what is actually being transmitted. And I'm very interested in keeping the work as simple as possible so that the transmission across it, its performance as the apparatus rather than the apparatus itself, can be heard. And I think that has become sort of the critical thing that I've aimed at in making work, letting that transaction become the thing, become the kind of presence of the piece. So in the case of this work, there are multiple instances of this, and I kind of really just want to talk about two of them. The first one has to do with this piece as a boundary. I've created a number of pieces where there are perforations through boundary planes, either through wall planes or through floor planes. And in particular, one work that I was commissioned to make in 2012 at the Baltimore Museum of Art was built into an interior wall, and it was a pair of parallel mirror planes that reflected your view down through the wall of the museum onto the viewers below you. And the entire apparatus is buried within the poche of this wall, within the thickness of this wall. It's sandwiched between these two white drywall sheets. And that means that in some ways it's a kind of opaque system. And I became very excited about building this work in such a way that suddenly this wall plane could become transparent. It could become a curtain wall. And at the same time, the piece would operate exactly the same way. And that in some ways makes the work much, much simpler, because then it's this sort of boundary, which is made of these two parallel vertical pieces of glass. And then it has this aperture, which happens in between the thickness of that wall plane as you look, let's say, through it, although you look through it in all directions now, which is a whole new wonderful thing. However, it still operates as a boundary. And that in some ways meant that the piece needed to become much simpler in order for these much more complicated transactions to occur. And that brings me to the second issue of its simplification. And that is that in reducing the work then became 4 pieces of a glass rather than a wall and glass and structure. It simply was reduced to 4, well, it's actually 8 because there's a pair, but each of the 2 sort of structures are created from 4 pieces of glass. And that simplification created tremendous complexity in terms of structural systems and fabrication systems. And it meant that we were working with just extraordinary teams, and there was, you know, what we saw as the initial video of the installation was only a very, 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 very small piece of the many, many, many layers of social exchange and basically sort of coordination that happened through machines and bodies and human beings and psychic states and all sorts of things over a very, very long period of time. But making it simple so that something complex can occur is really, it's really interesting.
Thank you. I think we are starting the audience Q&A at this point.
I want to jump in just to, first of all, thank you, Lumi, for being such an incredible partner in this project and contributing such a beautiful essay and audio guide and all of the things. And and this Q&A and exchange. We really appreciate you being part of our team in this effort. So thank you. And Sarah, wow, what an incredible journey, and the ways in which you have graced our campus with your thoughtfulness and your dedication, incredible optimism in the light of so many unforeseen conditions and limitations to the work which you inevitably translated into opportunities is really inspiring. So thank you. We are going to transition to the audience Q&As at this time, and there have been a lot of different questions that have been rolling in. And I thought maybe I could just begin with one question that I had listening to the both of you have this exchange, and that piqued my own curiosity, which is at the very beginning of the conversation, Sarah, you started talking about the piece that you wrote and about your thought around the array. I recall from an earlier conversation that you mentioned that it was in part inspired by your thinking about LeWitt and the ways that he had constructed a set of conditions for his own work, and that compelled you to imagine your own kind of set of circumstances with which you wanted to operate within. Anyway, I couldn't help but realize that, Lumi, when you started, you were asking about the title and about specific language, and LeWitt was very specific. He never wanted his pieces called sculptures. He always referred to them as structures. And I just thought it would be interesting to begin by diving into that a little bit and asking you, Sarah, if you might speak about relationships there, both in language and in terms of the form in which you've created these structures.
So, Andre, I think this is a really interesting question. And before I answer it, I want to say, I don't even know how to begin to say this, but so that I don't lose this opportunity, I want to say a huge thank you to everyone who has been involved in this. This has been a many year project, and I am so amazed by all of you and your tremendous work. And I feel just so fortunate to have the opportunity to work with you. So thank you so much. So LeWitt, I was, I'm speaking very specifically in writing this text. I was thinking about sentences on conceptual art, and I was thinking about how there was a real beauty in his capacity to sort of set up a playing field for his own work to operate within. And I don't know that, I think that there's something very important about how language intersects with this work in particular, because this work is not, I believe, a sign-based problem. And so there becomes this really odd relationship between an insistence on this perceptual or
I'm going to pause, but what do you mean by a sign-based problem?
I think that in some ways this work plays on the edge of when one is experiencing it in being there, as opposed to talking about it or representing it. I think it insists on some level on a bodily engagement with what is immediately around you, and also a sort of short-term memory of the place you occupy. And I do not think that that is, I don't think that's really a language game. I think that is, I'm not sure it's a pre-language game, because I don't believe in that sort of pre-post problem, but I think it sets up a question of how does language operate? How do names operate? How do titles operate? What is this piece doing? How do we talk about it? I suppose that's what I mean.
Great. So Lumi, why don't we look at some of these questions that have come in, because there are lots of really good ones. Well, this one is terrific. The question was whether or not the placement of the bike rack was intentional. That bike rack, that zigzaggy metal pattern that we saw, especially in the choreography video. The answer is no, it wasn't intentional. I think it was a happy accident. Wouldn't you agree?
I will say all accidents are happy in our built environment. It's sort of like the ADA code. I mean, we can't, this is a very important thing. I think that to erase the bike rack is to pretend that we don't exist in a very rule-bound and conventionally overlapping environment. And that's precisely what this work is about. So I think it's wonderful that there's a bike rack so present in the piece.
The next question I see in the chat is, when were you commissioned? And as I recall, you and I began conversations around 2017. Isn't that right? I think that's when the former dean of the Cockrell School, Sharon Wood, she and I had a conversation about your work. And that was at the really beginning stages of this building project. And I do remember having a conversation where I said, look, I think Sarah's the perfect person for this project, but if we want to work with her, then I think now's the time, because we're right at the beginning of imagining what this building is going to be. And if it's not the right person, then we can come up with other solutions down the road. And she was enthusiastic from the outset and said, yes, let's try to make this happen. So I think that's when we began our first conversations, and I visited your studio. So that would have been toward 5 years ago by now, right? Yeah. That's not unusual for landmarks projects. Our commissions are usually an average of 3 to 5 years. When is the recommended time of day to interact with the apparatus? Sarah, you have spent a lot of time with it. You've been with it at many different times of the day or night. What is your recommendation?
Well, I love that question, because one thing that's really amazing, if you spend, let's say, 24 hours with this piece, or in fact, many 24 hours, or let's say more like 18 windows, is you start to see patterns that happen at different times of day. And those patterns are really amazing to witness with and through the piece. So one type of pattern that happens is that the sun rises every 24 hours. So we could say that that's a really beautiful time to experience this work. But another pattern that happens is that classes have schedules, and that's also a weekly schedule, not just a daily schedule. So students start to flow in these kind of amazingly large sort of swarms through and around the piece and underneath the piece. And so depending on what time you're there, you'll find the bridge occupied or not occupied. And then there's also the weather. So what happens when it's this kind of crazy wind and the clouds overhead are just showing in this really extraordinary way, or what happens when it's nighttime and you start to get reflections through the piece or of the buildings across it. So all of these things are really interesting. And the reason I like that question is because it also imagines that time is cyclical. So I can say a time and it will always be that time. But you know, that time is always in flux. And so who knows what's going to happen at that time in some future date. I recommend multiple visits.
And this is somewhat related, but someone asked what happens to the piece when it rains. I don't know if you've witnessed that yet. But how that affects the experience.
It's amazing when it rains. I mean, when it rains, it becomes sort of opaque. And so it has this really amazing material transformation. And it also, it just sets up, it just starts to feel much more like a rigid thing. That transparent glass is really extraordinary because it really, it feels very not there, even though it's this massive boundary that obstructs passage across this bridge. So when it rains, it becomes much more present.
It also, I can say, I know, Luby, you haven't had the chance to see it yet, but the pieces, they really behave very differently depending on the light, the time of day, the weather. Everything about them really does change.
I was just going to say, I love this question that actually just came in on this topic, which is, as you mentioned, the wind. Someone was wondering if they function acoustically as well, which is something we haven't really touched upon at all.
So I have a few things to say about the wind and also acoustics. I think I've been increasingly interested in how sound operates as a kind of transmissive waveform, and how architectures and structures can shape and bend how sound extends and moves through our environment. So I think, yes, sound is definitely present. It becomes much more intimately sounding work when one is in it. But I think that there's another issue that comes up with wind, and that is also related to everything constantly being in flux, being that there's a lot of different forces operating on this work and also on the environment, which sort of holds and supports the work, being the bridge. And wind is one of those forces. And so one of the things that was really exciting about designing and developing this work was thinking about the constant motion and the differential motion between all of these things due to different loads. So live loads, such as human beings walking on the bridge, dead loads, such as rain or snow, in the case it might snow there on occasion, and also wind, which will obviously create this incredible force across the surface of this boundary plane.
Okay, so here's a question that's completely a shift of gears, but I think it's a really interesting one. The question is, how does your background in painting inform your work now as a sculptor, architect, and engineer?
I think painting is somehow everywhere here. And I think also my questions about painting are very much at the core of my questions about how an artwork performs. And I think painting in some ways historically has such an entanglement with architecture and spatial representation, that kind of extraordinary moment where there were these systems developed to, and many moments actually historically and culturally throughout the world, but systems that were developed to represent kind of knowable space or recognizable space. And I think that those systems, I'm thinking here of different types of projection systems, such as paraline projection systems or perspectival projection systems, are very much at the core of this work and very much at the core of representational technologies of architecture more generally in the present tense. And I think it just is driving it. But I also want to say about painting that painting has set up, I think, in a more contemporary moment, a question about the status of the object and the status of looking, and that relationship of how this thing we call a painting actually operates and sort of extends out from itself. And that's the question here. That's the question that's in my work deeply.
To me, that raises so many interesting relationships. You know, going back to Lumi, your question about the title and cinema, and the idea that the surface of this structure is a flat surface on which there's a projected plane that creates illusion, right? Or creates the sense of illusion. And that's light and the reflections that are caused by the glass and by the mirrored surfaces, etc. But then also to imagine that in relationship to painting and the idea of reproducing perspective and visible space in a way that creates a kind of sense of openness and familiarity. And so it's an interesting immersion to me, because you are taking these elements of painting and that kind of legacy of creating pictorial plane, but you're doing it in a way that is sort of upside down, because it is a reflection, it is interactive, it is engaging and kind of dependent upon the participants to actually activate. Does that seem fair?
You know, I'm just realizing in a way, in hearing you, Andre, there's a very simple answer to this question, which is, you know, painting in so many instances is a window. And I'm interested in that. And I'm interested in actually being able to be in that thickness of that window, that stretch it out and be in it.
I think we might have time for one more question before we wrap up here. Anastasia writes, photography of the project, the photographer is invisible, which is how the artwork is typically documented. Given the artwork's function as an apparatus, which implies human involvement, did you ever consider including the photographer in the documentation of the project?
So I think that's a great question.
I do too.
And I have a comment about that question that's very specific to this work, which is the glass that is reflective, that has a reflective coating on it, and therefore appears mirrored, which is, you know, it's always a percentage. It's never a fully reflective thing. But in this case, this reflective surface is angled at 45 degrees to the line of sight, meaning that if you look at it straight ahead, you will never see yourself. The only way you see yourself is by angling yourself at this very awkward position to it. And it's very specific because that relationship then means that you're always looking out and engaging with the other, and that other is always looking in and looking at you, to sort of throw that back and forth. And it means that then the photographer would have to do, in this case, quite some sort of acrobatics to include themselves in the picture. But yes, I would definitely include the photographer in the picture if it was, if the photographer was reflected.
I said that was the last question, but Branko has put a really beautiful sentiment in there. Lumi, do you want to read it?
Absolutely. Well, I'll read the whole thing because I think we should. So Branko says, I have no words to express how much I am amazed. Sarah is one of the most innovative and visionary artists and engineers that I know. I am also amazed by UT for the openness and receptiveness for this relatively new art. My question is how the process of creation started and to what extent it was collaborative with UT.
How the process, so thank you for that really generous comment. I think that the process started sort of organically through a number of conversations and through a site visit, actually, where I was invited to come to this location where the bridge and the building did not exist. There was actually another building there. And in fact, the whole situation was very different. And it was a really unusual conversation because, in fact, I was looking at radically other things like trees. And I had no idea there was going to be a bridge there. So the piece really started as a set of sort of social exchanges and conversations. And I think this question about UT is also very interesting because what has become clear to me is that UT is a name which holds many different people, and many people that are not actually employed directly by UT. And so UT, as this kind of large institution, has been deeply involved in this project. But the way I've had contact with UT has been really on an individualized and sort of specific granular level. And so I wouldn't actually think of it as UT, I would think of it as a person or a group of people's contribution to the work.
And I'll just add to that, yeah, I feel like I agree with you completely, Sarah. UT is multivalent. There's so many different organizations and units within it, and so many personalities driving each of those different portions of the university. And you have come into contact with many, many, many of them, much more than most would when engaging with UT. And as I've said before, I think through the process, you've made a lot of fans. I will wrap us up at this time. And thank you again, Lumi, for your incredible contributions to this project over a very long period of time. We appreciate all the ways that you have shared your really thoughtful insights to our program. And Sarah, wow, this is the beginning of the end of our development and installation and launching to the world, but it's also just the very beginning of a very long relationship, and having your work grace our campus. And I love imagining the many, many generations of students who will encounter it, be curious about it, and discover a whole new world just by learning about you and this particular piece. So thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight.